Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. Let me begin with a sentence that will irritate nearly everyone who hears it. Conservatism is not the politics of strength. It is the politics of restraint. A statement should not be controversial, and yet, in 2025, it feels almost heretical, an indication not of its falsehood, but of how far political language has drifted from its original meaning. The discomfort it produces is a diagnostic. It reveals something broken in us, not in conservatism itself, but in the way politics is now discussed, understood, and pursued. Because today, nearly everywhere you look, politics is framed almost exclusively in terms of power, not in truth or legitimacy, not in law, not in moral obligation, not in the Constitution, but in power. Who has it? Who lost it? Who needs to seize it? Who must be crushed to obtain it? And what should we do when we get it? Now, this language dominates cable news and online commentary, even top-level politicians in our country on both sides of the aisle. It saturates campaign speeches and donor emails. It animates activist rhetoric and increasingly defines what passes for serious political analysis, even in spaces that call themselves conservative. The tone varies, the enemies change, the aesthetics differ, but the underlying framework remains the same. Politics, we are told, is a struggle for dominance. But here's the problem. That framework is not conservative, and it's not American, and it's not rooted in the worldview of the Founding Fathers. In fact, it's alien to it. The founders did not understand politics as a contest for control. They understood it as a system for restraining control. They did not design government to empower the righteous. They designed it to limit the dangerous. Their entire project rested on sober, unsentimental assessment of human nature, one that modern political movements, left and right, seem determined to forget. They assumed ambition. They assumed self-interest. They anticipated corruption. And because they understood power's tendency to expand, they built a constitutional order designed not to wield it efficiently, but to frustrate it deliberately. Separation of powers, checks and balances, federalism, enumerated authority, due process. These were not technical features. They were moral ones. The American system was built not to win quickly, but to endure. That distinction matters because the language of power that dominates modern politics does not come from American tradition at all. It comes from a much later intellectual current, one that explicitly rejected the idea of objective truth, universal principles, and legitimacy grounded in reason. It is a worldview shaped by postmodern and post-liberal thought, where truth is treated as contingent, morality is constructed, and law is an expression of dominance rather than of justice. In that framework, politics becomes strategy, speech becomes a weapon, institutions become tools, and restraint becomes weakness. Once you accept this premise, everything else follows. If there is no neutral law, only power relations, then legitimacy is an illusion. If there are no universal standards, only competing narratives, then persuasion is naive and coercion becomes rational. Anything is permissible. If politics is merely about who wins, the only sin is losing. This is why power talk spreads so easily, because it's seductive. It feels real. It feels realistic. It flatters the cynical and energizes the angry. It offers a shortcut around the hard work of moral reasoning and institutional discipline. Why argue about what is right when you can argue about who is stronger? But this is precisely where conservatism is supposed to intervene, and precisely where it is now failing. Conservatism exists to slow things down, to say no, to impose limits, to insist that some methods are unacceptable, even when they're effective. A conservative argument does not begin with how do we win. It begins with what must never be done. That question has nearly vanished from public life. Instead, we are told explicitly and implicitly that extraordinary times require extraordinary measures, that norms are luxuries, that restraint is obsolete in the face of existential threats. Every generation believes its crisis is unique. Every movement convinces itself that it alone can be trusted with power. And every society that accepts that logic eventually discovers the same goddamn lesson. Power does not remain neutral, borrowed, or temporary. It expands, it hardens, it selects for the ruthless. History is not ambiguous about this. When politics collapses into power struggles, law becomes optional. When law becomes optional, legitimacy dissolves. And when legitimacy dissolves, violence, whether physical, institutional, or cultural, inevitably fills the vacuum. What we are witnessing today is not merely polarization. It's something far more dangerous, the replacement of principle with power as the organizing logic of political life. That shift does not produce stability. It produces escalation, and it does not restore order. It destroys the conditions that make order possible. A society can survive disagreement. It has. It can survive bad leaders. It has. It can even survive lost elections. What it cannot survive is the abandonment of the idea that power must be restrained by something higher than itself. This was the founders' central insight. And forgetting it has always carried the same cost. To understand why modern power talk is corrosive, we first have to recover what conservatism is in reality, because much of the confusion today stems from the fact that the word itself has been hollowed out. Conservatism is not a list of policy positions. It's not a personality type. It's not nostalgia or aesthetics or vibes or branding. It's not defined by what it opposes, nor the tone it adopts, nor the cultural signals it broadcasts. Those things may accompany conservatism at various moments in history, but they are not its essence. It is something far more foundational. It's a moral and political anthropology, a theory of human nature and its limits, and a system of governance built around that understanding. This is where the founders began, and it is where modern politics has drifted furthest away. The founders understood something that contemporary political movements, left and right, increasingly refuse to accept. Human beings are not angels. They are not purely rational actors. They are not reliably virtuous. They are not immune to temptation once they acquire authority over other people. We are ambitious, self-justifying. We're capable of reason, but prone to rationalization. We're capable of virtue, but easily seduced by power. This was not a cynical view of humanity. It was a sober one. The founders did not believe people were evil. They believed they were people, human beings. And because they understood human nature, they refused to build a political system that depended on moral perfection. And that is why the American constitutional order does not begin with authority. It begins with constraints. For example, James Madison did not say, because men are evil, we must empower the good. That idea, so common today, would have struck him as dangerously naive, populist demagoguery. Instead, Madison argued that because men are not angels, power itself must be restrained. The problem was not merely who held authority, but the nature of authority once it existed. That distinction is everything. Modern politics is obsessed with the identity of the ruler. The founders were obsessed with the structure of the fucking rule. They did not ask how to guarantee the right people would always be in charge. They assumed the wrong people eventually would be, and they designed accordingly. The Constitution is not a declaration of strength. It's not a manifesto of power. It's not a tool for rapid action or decisive domination. It is a machine designed to slow power down, to fracture it, to frustrate it, and to prevent it from consolidating in any single set of hands. Separation of powers exists to pit ambition against ambition, not to streamline governance. Federalism exists to divide authority geographically so that no single center can dominate. Due process exists not to protect the popular or the powerful, but the unpopular, the accused, and the outnumbered. Enumerated powers exist to confine government action within defined boundaries rather than allow it to expand opportunistically. These features were not bugs. They were the entire point. Every friction in the system was intentional. Every inefficiency was deliberate. The founders understood that speed is the ally of tyranny and that restraint is the price of liberty. A conservative system, properly understood, does not ask, how do we win? That question presumes the goal of politics is victory. It presumes that the primary danger is losing control to one's enemies. The founders understood the deep danger, abuse by those in control. So the conservative question has always been quite a bit different. How do we prevent abuse when the wrong people inevitably gain power? And that is the question modern power-obsessed politics refuses to ask. Today's political discourse is animated by fantasy that if the right people seize power, the usual rules no longer apply, that constitutional constraints are luxuries in a time of crisis, that power can be sacrificed for outcome, that legitimacy can be postponed until after victory is secured. This fantasy is not new. It appears in every collapsing republic. The language always changes, but the logic remains the same. Our moment is exceptional. Our enemies are uniquely dangerous. Therefore, restraint is obsolete. Our democracy, our generation, so on and so forth. Every generation that embraces this reasoning believes it is acting pragmatically. Every one of them discovers too late that they have dismantled the very safeguards that once protected them. Conservatism exists precisely to resist that impulse. It is in this moment that what you do matters. It insists that power is dangerous, even when wielded by those with good intentions. It insists that law must bind rulers as well as the ruled. It insists that process matters more than passion, and that limits matter more than speed. This is why all the modern power talk is so corrosive. It abandons the founders' anthropology and replaces it with something closer to revolutionary thinking. And that is the belief that power is neutral, that it can be safely concentrated in the hands of the righteous, air quotes on the righteous, and that moral outcomes justify procedural shortcuts. That belief is not conservative. It is profoundly anti-conservative, actually, which is shocking to me because there's a lot of so-called conservatives who hold those positions. And if you knew what the word meant, you would either change your beliefs or you would call yourself something else. Now, this assumes that the problem with power is simply who controls it, not what power does to those who possess it. It assumes that abuse is an aberration rather than a predictable consequence of authority. It assumes that safeguards are obstacles rather than necessities. Now, the founders assume the opposite, obviously. They assume that power would always be tempted to exceed its bounds. They assume that majorities would sometimes act unjustly. They assume that emergencies would be exploited. They assume that passions would override reason when unchecked by structure. And because they assumed all this, they built a system that does not rely on virtue alone. It relies on design. It's a filter. Modern politics has largely abandoned that design philosophy. It has replaced it with moral confidence and tactical urgency. Instead of asking how to constrain authority, it asks how to wield it more effectively. We have to use the power of the left. You've heard that phrase, including from the vice president. It's nonsense, and it's not conservative. Instead of fearing concentration of power, it seeks power. Instead of distrusting ambition, it celebrates it, so long as it serves the correct cause. That shift represents not an evolution of conservatism, but an inversion of it. A conservative movement that embraces power-first thinking has forgotten its own fucking purpose. It has traded skepticism for certainty, restraint for ambition, and legitimacy for leverage. In doing so, it has adopted the very logic it was meant to oppose. The founders did not believe liberty could be preserved by strong men alone. They believed it could only be preserved by strong institutions designed to survive weak, ambitious, and flawed men. That is the insight modern politics is racing to abandon now. And history is unambiguous about what the cost of doing so is. Now, the language of power that dominates modern politics did not come from the American founding. So these people who would call themselves America First, who espouse these ideas, aren't. Simple. It did not emerge from the tradition of natural rights, constitutional restraint, or ordered liberty. It comes from a much later intellectual movement, one that arose in explicit opposition to the very ideas the founders treated as self-evident. That movement rejected natural law. It rejected objective truth. It rejected universal moral principles. In their place, it offered something far more corrosive. Politics grounded not in legitimacy, but in power. This worldview was refined and systematized in the 20th century by thinkers associated with the Frankfurt School, the second generation, maybe, of political activist Marxist, and the intellectual currents that followed from it. Now, while their conclusions differed in emphasis, they shared a common starting point, one that proved devastating to any conception of constitutional government. Their premise was simple. There's no neutral truth. There's no objectivity. There's only power. Truth, they argued, is not something discovered through reason or moral reflection. It is constructed by those who dominate cultural institutions. Morality is not an objective standard that binds rulers and ruler alike. It's a social product shaped to legitimize existing hierarchies. Reason itself is not a pathway to understanding, but a rhetorical tool used by elites to mask their interest in the language of universality. Law, in this framework, is no longer a restraint on authority. It's an expression of authority. Institutions do not exist to serve justice or protect rights. They exist to preserve power relations, to keep people in power. Once this premise is accepted, everything else follows logically and disastrously. If there's no objective truth, persuasion becomes pointless. I don't have to prove my point to you. I don't have to win you over. If there are no universal standards, legitimacy becomes meaningless. If morality is merely constructed, then constraint is arbitrary. Politics ceases to be a moral enterprise and becomes just strategy. In such a world, the truth no longer matters. Only outcomes do. Speech no longer aims to persuade free individuals. It aims to manipulate audiences. Law no longer restrains power. It becomes a mechanism for enforcing dominance. Institutions are no longer evaluated by whether they are just, but by whether they are useful. So if you're wondering about the DEI nonsense or buying votes and all this, there you have it. And once politics becomes nothing more than power analysis, everything becomes justified. Censorship becomes protection. Coercion becomes liberation. Violence becomes contextual, fiery but mostly peaceful. Words that once described moral wrongs are inverted and repurposed. Kafka traps. The content changes, but the logic remains intact. Whatever advances the cause is justified, because there is no higher standard by which to judge the cause itself. The cause is what matters. Remember that. The issue is never the issue. The issue is always the revolution. This is not a theoretical concern. It is the lived reality of politics. What makes this framework especially dangerous, and what many conservatives fail to grasp, is that it is ideologically neutral. It does not belong exclusively to the left. It does not require Marxism or progressivism or any particular policy agenda. It can be adopted by anyone. Once politics is reduced to power competition, there's no principled reason your opponents should restrain themselves. There's no reason they should honor norms you have abandoned. There's no reason they should respect limits you no longer believe in. In fact, they are incentivized not to. Power politics does not reward moderation. It does not reward honesty or restraint. It rewards the most ruthless motherfucker, the one most willing to bend or break the rules, weaponize institutions, and discard moral hesitation. Always, always. It is the worst form of government. And this is why power-first thinking is so self-defeating for conservatives. By accepting the premise that politics is fundamentally about dominance, they surrender the only advantage constitutionalism ever possessed: legitimacy. The American founders understood that power without legitimacy is unstable. They understood that force can compel obedience, but it cannot sustain loyalty. They understood that a republic depends not merely on control, but on consent of the government, and that consent cannot be manufactured through coercion indefinitely. The postmodern framework rejects this entirely. It treats consent as illusion. Legitimacy is myth, and persuasion is naivete. In its place, it offers a grimly consistent worldview. Politics is war by other means, and law is simply a weapon in that war. Lawfare. Once conservatives adopt this framework, even partially, they abandon their own intellectual inheritance. They cease to argue from first principles and begin arguing from leverage. They stop asking whether something is right and start asking whether it is effective. They replace moral reasoning with tactical calculation. At that point, no contest is between constitutionalism and its critic. Rather, it is between rival factions competing within the same nihilistic framework. And that contest never ends well and never has in all of human history. History is unambiguous on this point. When politics becomes a competition for power unconstrained by principles, the outcome is never ordered liberty, it's escalation. Each side justifies its excesses by pointing to the excesses of the other. Norms erode, institutions hollow out, violence, whether physical, legal, or cultural, becomes normalized. And I don't give a shit who started it. I don't want to hear your complaining about who started what. Be the adult. Be the adult. Save your country. And stop whining about what everybody else is doing. Those who believe they can wield this framework responsibly always discover the same truth. Too late. Power does not remain in the hands of the cautious. No matter how good your intentions are, somebody's coming behind you who is going to use the power you gained for evil. It doesn't reward those who intended to restore restraint later. It flows toward those most willing to use it without hesitation. That's how power works. This is why the founders rejected power politics so thoroughly. They did not deny that power existed. They denied that it could be trusted. They didn't pretend politics was free from conflict. They insisted that conflict be constrained by law and principle. And they didn't assume virtue would prevail. They designed institutions to survive its absence. The modern language of power abandons that wisdom. It assumes that the problem is not power itself, but who controls it. It assumes that concentration of authority is safe, so long as the intentions are correct. It assumes that legitimacy can be postponed until after victory is secured. Those assumptions have been tested repeatedly throughout history, and they failed every fucking time. Every time. Power politics always favors the most unscrupulous actor. Always. And any movement that forgets this lesson will eventually be governed by someone who remembers it all too well. One of the most revealing phrases in modern political discourse is deceptively simple. We just need to win in the midterms or the next election or whatever it is. It's usually delivered with urgency, sometimes with exhaustion. Often it's delivered with anger. It sounds practical and realistic. It sounds like the voice of someone who believes the stakes are high and the situation is dire. It sounds sincere. But it is also one of the most dangerous sentences a political movement can utter. Win what? And by what means? And for what purpose? And under what constraints? Those questions are almost never asked. Who gets power after I gain it? Because you don't live forever. The phrase, we just need to win, presumes that victory is the goal of politics. It assumes that control is the ultimate prize and that everything else, process, legitimacy, law, and restraint, are secondary or even optional. It frames politics not as a moral enterprise, but as a contest. Not as stewardship of our birthright, but as conquest. The mindset would have been deeply foreign to the American founders. They were not obsessed with winning. They were obsessed with legitimacy. They understood something modern political movements, even on your side, across the spectrum, seem determined to forget. A republic can survive losing elections. It can survive bad leaders. It can survive periods of instability and disagreement, but not the collapse of legitimacy, as it is the invisible infrastructure of self-government. The North Star, the thing we can all appeal to. The shared belief that authority is exercised according to agreed rules, that outcomes are binding even when unfavorable, and that power is constrained by something higher than immediate advantage. Without legitimacy, politics does not disappear, it mutates. It becomes coercive, unstable, and ultimately violent. And this is why the founders placed such extraordinary emphasis on process. Process was not a technical detail, it was the moral core of the system. They understood that outcomes change Coalitions shift and public opinion fluctuates. What had to endure was the belief that rules applied consistently. And when doing so was inconvenient or costly, especially, that belief is what allows rivals to remain citizens rather than enemies. And it also allows you to navigate times of great discomfort when, let's say, the quote unquote other side is up to no good. If there is indeed illegal immigration leading to voter fraud and welfare scandals and all this stuff, there are constitutional processes in place to handle this. We don't abandon the Constitution because the other side cheated. That is not an American ideal, and it's not conservative, and the founders would not have done that. And it's why rights were never contingent on popularity. The founders didn't design a system where rights were granted by majorities. They designed one where rights existed prior to politics itself. The majority could govern, but it could not override the moral claims of the individual without destroying the legitimacy of the system. This is why enemies were entitled to due process, not because the founders were naive about human evil, but because they understood the danger of unbounded power. Once the state is permitted to discard procedural restraint in the name of necessity, there's no principled stopping point. The exception becomes the rule. The emergency becomes permanent. And this is why law-bound rulers as well as the rule. The founders did not believe legitimacy flowed upward from power. They believed it flowed downward from law. Authority was not self-justifying. It had to be exercised within defined limits. There's no divine right of kings in this country. Otherwise, it ceases to be lawful authority at all. Modern power first thinking rejects this entire framework. It treats the process as an obstacle, restraint as weakness, legitimacy as something to be restored after victory. Once we win, we'll go back to playing by the rules. I promise. Its guiding principle is simple. Whatever tools are available are what you should use, regardless of the ethics. Conservatism, properly understood, says the opposite. It insists that some tools must never be used, no matter how effective they may appear in the short term. It insists that certain lines cannot be crossed without corrupting the very ends one claims to pursue, and that power is exercised, or how power is exercised matters more than whether it's exercised successfully. It's not idealism. It is realism at the civilizational level. If you want to persist, the moment a movement decides the ends justify the means, it has already forfeited the moral ground required to govern legitimately. And it may still win battles. It may still capture institutions, as some on the right want to do. They want to capture institutions, which is insane. It may command obedience for a time, but it has lost the justification that makes authority stable rather than brittle. You have to govern that way forever. There's no way to capture an institution in these unethical means and then shift back to doing things ethically afterwards. It doesn't exist. And the logic of escalation takes over. If ends justify means, restraint's irrational. Escalation is inevitable. And the only remaining question is who escalates faster? Who hits the nuclear button first? Who gets to survive? And that's the hidden cost of we just need to win. Transforms politics into a fucking arms race. Each side justifies its excesses by pointing to the excesses of the other. Norms erode asymmetrically at first, and then symmetrically, one after another. Finally, you can't find them at all. What began as an exception becomes the precedent. What was once unthinkable becomes routine. Those who believe they can wield extraordinary power responsibly always make the same mistake. They assume they will remain in control of it, and they never do. Power does not reward those who intend to restore constraint later. It rewards the most willing to exploit its absence now. Once the logic of necessity replaces the logic of legitimacy, authority flows toward the most ruthless actor, not the most principled one. The founders understood this dynamic instinctively. They had studied history very closely. They knew how republics failed, not all at once, but incrementally. As each generation convinced itself that its crisis justified abandoning the old limits, this time it's different. They did not design a system to guarantee righteous outcomes. They designed a system to make abuse difficult. And when abuse happens, to give recourse, to hold those people who did it accountable. This is why winning was never the primary concern. The purpose of politics, as they understood it, was not domination, it was continuity, which is why we have the longest running constitutional republic in human history. It was the preservation of a framework in which disagreement could occur without destroying the bonds of citizenship. It was the maintenance of a system strong enough to absorb conflict without resorting to force. A republic that prioritizes winning over legitimacy ceases to be a republic in any meaningful way. It becomes a factional regime, one victory away from becoming exactly what it once claimed to oppose. This is the paradox modern movements refuse to confront. You cannot secure a free society by abandoning the principles that made you free in the fucking first place. You cannot preserve legitimacy by treating it as expendable, and you cannot govern justly by adopting the logic of conquest. We have to use the other side's weapons like they do. We just need to win. It sounds pragmatic. In reality, it's an admission of intellectual and moral surrender. It concedes that principles are luxuries and limits are optional, and that the law is simply instrumental. That's for somebody else, or that's for us to use, but not to govern. And once those concessions are made, the outcome is no longer in doubt. It's all over but the fat lady singing. The founders built a system to restrain this impulse precisely because they knew it would arise, because they had seen it all throughout human history. They didn't expect citizens or leaders to be immune to ambition. They expected ambition and designed institutions to contain it. Modern power-first politics does the opposite. It unleashes ambition and calls it realism. It treats escalation as courage. And in the inverse, it treats a refusal to escalate as weakness. And it mistakes aggression for strength. The loudest guy in the room is the weakest guy in the room. Keep that in mind. In doing so, it forgets the most important lesson the founders ever taught. Power is easy to seize, but legitimacy is fragile. And once it's gone, no amount of winning can ever bring it back. It's not a theoretical warning. It's an historical one. Now I want to talk a little bit about identity. Specifically, identity politics and the death of the individual. Because the right has very recently become extremely susceptible to this stupid bullshit. Identity politics is often described as an ideology, but that description gives it too much credit. It's not a coherent theory of justice, governance, or human flourishing. It does not offer a vision of a good society, nor does it propose a principled framework for resolving disputes. Identity politics is something far simpler and more dangerous. It's a fucking shortcut. It is a way to bypass moral reasoning entirely and the responsibilities required of you to apply that reasoning. Instead of asking, is it true? You ask, who's speaking? Instead of asking, is this just? You ask, which group benefits from this? Now, those substitutions may feel subtle, but they represent a fundamental transformation in how politics operates. That is not meritocratic thinking. Once those questions replace one another, the entire moral architecture of a society collapses. Truth ceases to be something that can be discovered, argued for, or defended on its own merits. It becomes contextual. And then it becomes inseparable from identity. Justice ceases to be a universal standard applied impartially. It becomes an accounting exercise, an attempt to balance historical grievances through present-day redistribution of power. That's what DEI was. And now there are many on the right who would like to see reverse DEI, if you want to call it that. The solution to past racism or injustice is never present and future racism and injustice. That's fucking stupid. This is why identity politics is so corrosive. It replaces universal standards, that is to say, natural law, observable law of the universe, with tribal arithmetic. Bullshit. Every claim is evaluated not by its substance, but by the characteristics of the person making it. Even the deeply racist pro-slavery Aristotle made this point over 2,000 years ago, listing logical fallacies of the sophist. Every policy is judged not by whether it is just, lawful, or effective, but by which groups it appears to advantage or disadvantage. Moral reasoning gives way to scorekeeping. Law gives way to narrative, and citizenship gives way to faction. And the American founders rejected this bullshit. They didn't do so because they were naive. They did so because they were not blind to human difference or historical injustice. They rejected it because they understood what happens to societies that organize political life around group identity rather than the individual moral agency. And the founders' understanding rights attached to individuals, not to groups. They're not granted by the state, not contingent on membership, and not distributed according to collective characteristics. Rights are inherent claims possessed by human beings as such. The principle is the cornerstone of liberal constitutional order. Likewise, guilt is personal, not collective. The founders rejected the idea that moral responsibility could be inherited or transferred through identity. A person is accountable for his actions alone, not for the actions of others who share his race or religion, class, or ancestry. Anything else would violate the most basic requirements of justice, that you be treated as an individual before the law and before God. And law, to be law at all, must apply universally. Either it binds everyone or it binds no one, even kings. A legal system that applies different rules to different groups is not a system of law at all. It's a system of power allocation masquerading as justice. The moment identity becomes the primary unit of political meaning, the rule of law begins to dissolve. Rights become conditional, granted or withheld based on group membership, whether it's party or race or creed or whatever, rather than individual conduct. Citizenship becomes tribal, defined by allegiance to identity blocks rather than shared civic obligations. This is how cultures who were once great begin to fail, because loyalty to the group matters more than justice and law and natural law and morals and ethics. Justice becomes retaliatory. It's not about restoring order anymore, but it's about redressing grievances from the past through punishment and redistribution. At that point, politics no longer mediates. Disagreement within a shared framework becomes a permanent contest between factions, each, of course, claiming moral supremacy based on victimhood or history or whatever the fuck else. And it's not a hypothetical concern. It is the predictable outcome of identity politics. Identity politics thrives precisely because it offers an escape from the hard work of moral judgment. It's lazy. It allows movements to avoid making universal claims that could be tested, challenged, or falsified. Instead of defending a policy as just in principle, you can defend it as necessary for a particular group. Instead of persuading opponents, one can delegitimize them by questioning their identity or their motives. You just have, even when it's a black person who doesn't agree with DEI, they say it's internalized self-hate or internalized whiteness. What the fuck does that mean? It's why identity politics spread so easily across the ideological spectrum. Now, it's often treated as a phenomenon of the left, but that is a category error. While it has been aggressively institutionalized by progressive movements, its underlying logic is not left-wing or right-wing. It's opportunistic. Any movement that abandons universal standards in favor of group-based reasoning has adopted identity politics, postmodernism, regardless of which identity it elevates. And this is why a conservative movement that embraces identity politics, even in response to left-wing identity politics, has already lost the argument. It may gain short-term rhetorical leverage. It may mobilize some anger. It may even achieve electoral success. But it does so at the cost of the very principle that distinguishes conservatism from revolutionary politics, the defense of the individual as the basic unit of moral and political concern. And anybody who doesn't believe in that is not American, and they're sure as shit not conservative. Now, once conservatives accept the premise that justice depends on group identity, they have conceded the most important ground in the debate. They have abandoned the idea of equal law in favor of reciprocal grievance. This is Marxism. They have replaced constitutionalism with factionalism. They have traded legitimacy for symmetry. And symmetry is not fucking justice. The appeal of fight fire with fire is understandable. Identity politics creates pressure to respond in kind. When one side organizes politically around race, gender, religion, nationality, the temptation is to counter it along similar lines, to meet group claims with group claims, to answer tribal politics with tribal politics of one's own. This is bullshit, and it misunderstands the nature of the threat. Identity politics does not merely disadvantage one faction, it corrupts the entire fucking framework. It transforms politics from a dispute over policy within a shared legal order into a struggle over which group gets to define the fucking order. Once that transformation occurs, no side can win without further degrading the system. You have to reshape it in your own image, and it never works. The founders understood this. They had studied the failures of ancient republics and the violence of religious and ethnic conflict in Europe. They knew that once politics became organized around collective identity, the compromise became betrayal, and defeat became existential. Every election, we won't survive this. And compromising with the so-called enemy is a betrayal of one's principles. Well, tell that to the founders who compromised on literally everything. I guess they were all traitors. To themselves? To whom? That is why they insisted on abstract principles rather than particular identities. In fact, they warned quite heavily about demagoguery and about populism. Abstract principles can bind strangers. We are a creedal society. By a creed, somebody who believes in individual liberty and is willing to support and defend it with their life is someone that you can call brother. They can mediate conflict between people who do not share any culture, religion, or ancestry, because that is their culture. Their culture becomes the truth. Do you see? The individual becomes their culture. Identity cannot do that. Identity defies by definition. A political order grounded in individual rights can accommodate diversity because it treats difference as morally irrelevant to legal standing. All men are created equal? Maybe you've heard that one. A political order grounded in identity must constantly adjudicate which differences matter more, and that adjudication never ends. It's the outrage Olympics, into perpetuity. And this is the deeper reason identity politics produces permanent instability, because there is no natural stopping point. New identities emerge, old grievances are reinterpreted. That's what the 1619 Project is. They tried to restart or reset the date where America started to begin with slavery. Why do you think they did that? To define us as a slave state, even though the Brits and Americans ended slavery. Power shifts, and with it, the moral hierarchy changes. But morality never really changes. And justice becomes a moving target, defined not by principle, but by political strength. Show me the man and I'll show you the crime. Maybe you've heard that. In such a system, law has no authority. It becomes temporary arrangement, reflecting the current balance of power rather than a stable expression of shared norms. Citizens cease to view one another as equals under the law and begin to see one another as competitors for advantage. Truth erodes, social cohesion frays, political lines harden into cultural warfare. At this stage, the language of rights becomes hollow. Rights are no longer protections against power. They are rewards distributed by it. Citizenship can no longer describe accurately a shared civic identity. It describes membership in whatever the favored group is. Are you a party member? Not am I a citizen. And justice no longer aims at fairness, just to redress retribution. None of this is accidental. It is the logical consequence of replacing individual moral agency with a collective identity. as the foundation of public life. You may have heard over the weekend the incoming mayor of New York City say that we're going to replace rugged individualism with warm collectivism. That's Marxist bullshit, my friend. Not that it's surprising to hear that communists use it, but wow, you just said it out loud, huh? This is why the founders' insistence on individual rights was not merely philosophical, it was practical. They understood that a republic composed of diverse people could only survive if it treated citizens as individuals before the law. If our culture rose above the individual tenets of each culture, their religion, their customs, etc., to establish one law, and any deviation from that principle would eventually turn diversity into division, which it has in this country, and disagreement into conflict, which it has in this country. A conservative movement that forgets this lesson is not going to conserve anything. It is accelerating the breakdown, and it claims to oppose. It's a lie. It's not a conservative movement. To abandon the individual is to abandon the rule of law. To abandon the rule of law is to abandon legitimacy, and to abandon legitimacy is to invite power politics in its most destructive form. Identity politics promises justice through recognition and redistribution. In practice, it delivers resentment, instability, and perpetual conflict. It does not heal any historical wounds. It reopens them and institutionalizes them. And it doesn't create solidarity. It fragments society into competing moral claims. Now, the founders chose a different path. Not because it was easy, because it was the only one that fucking worked. They built a system that asked citizens to meet one another, not as representatives of groups, but as equal participants in a shared legal order. They understood that this demand would never be perfectly satisfied. They also understood that abandoning it would be a guarantee of failure, but participating in it is the ultimate inoculation to tyranny. If people are trying to divide you, they're trying to conquer you. But if you are so close they can't get between you because of your shared cultural values, because of your shared respect for the law and our Constitution, then nobody can divide you and nobody can rule you. Now, that insight remains as true now as it was then. And any movement, left or right, that forgets it will discover sooner or later that identity politics does not solve political problems. It replaces them with something far worse. I want to talk about Rome for a second because I'm a man and I can't help myself, but Rome didn't fall because it lacked strong men. It fell because strong men stopped believing they were bound by the rules. And that distinction matters because Rome is often misremembered as a civilization undone by decadence, weakness, or external pressure. In reality, the late Roman Republic was filled with capable leaders and disciplined soldiers and deeply serious men who believed themselves to be guardians of tradition. Its collapse was not the result of feebleness, it was the result of impatience. Specifically, conservative impatience with restraint. The Roman conservatives, known as the Optimates, believed they were defending the Republic against populist demagogues who threatened its stability. Does that sound familiar? And at first, they were right. Figures like the Gracchi brothers did attempt to mobilize mass resentment against institutional limits. They appealed directly to popular anger, bypassed senatorial norms, and treated procedure as an obstacle rather than as a safeguard. The Optimates understood the danger of this approach. They believed in tradition, hierarchy, law, continuity. They feared the mob. They feared instability. They feared that once rules were discarded, the Republic would not survive. What they failed to understand was that their response would prove just as destructive as the threat they opposed. Under mounting pressure, the Optimates began to abandon restraint, not all at once, but incrementally as it happens. Each step was justified by circumstances. Each exception was framed as temporary. Each violation of norms was explained as necessary to save the Republic from something far worse. Now, emergency decrees became routine. Procedural safeguards became negotiable. Violence became defensible as long as it was directed at the right targets. The Senate invoked extraordinary powers to bypass traditional limits. Political rivals are treated not merely as opponents, but as existential threats. The language of necessity replaced the language of law. Every one of these decisions made sense in the moment, and that is the lesson modern observers often miss. The fall of Rome was not driven by cartoon villainy or obvious malice. It was driven by rationalizations made under pressure by men who believed themselves to be acting responsibly, pragmatically, even heroically in some cases. But every exception they made weakened legitimacy. What the optimates failed to grasp was that legitimacy is not preserved by force. It's preserved by consistency. Once citizens begin to believe that the rules apply only when convenient, they stop following the fucking rules. And as legitimacy eroded, power shifted. Politics became more volatile. Norms that once governed behavior lost their authority. Men learned that ambition could no longer be restrained within traditional offices and procedures. And if you can't trust those institutions, then you have to create power for yourself. If emergency powers could be invoked once, they could be invoked again. And eventually, generals began to realize what senators had tried to ignore. Real power no longer flowed from institutions, it flowed from force. By the time figures like Sulla and later Caesar marched on Rome claiming to act, quote, in defense of the Republic was already a shell. Its formal structures remained, but their moral authority had evaporated. People had no trust in them, so a leader like Caesar was acceptable. The idea that political disputes could be resolved within the system no longer commanded belief. Rome did not collapse in a single moment. It hollowed out over decades. What followed was not restoration, but transformation. The Republic, as they do, gave way to autocracy, not because Romans desired tyranny, but because the conditions that made republican governance possible had been destroyed. And when legitimacy disappears, people do not demand more process. They demand order. That's why tyranny almost always follows the fall of republics. And it's a central irony of Rome's fall, that the conservatives who believed they were defending tradition accelerated its destruction by abandoning the very restraints that tradition required. Rome did not die from rebellion alone. It died from conservative impatience. The Roman experience offers a warning that remains painfully relevant. Once political actors decide that the rules are expendable in the face of crisis, the crisis never fucking ends. Each escalation invites another. Each justification becomes precedent. And eventually the system no longer restrains anyone at all. At that point, the only remaining question is not who's right, but who's strongest. And Rome answered that question. And in doing so, it became an empire, not a republic. And sure, Augustus was fine. A decent ruler, Pax Romana, right? And then 3 of the next 4 emperors that followed him were insane people and led to the destruction of the republic, or the destruction of the empire even. Another good example is the Weimar Republic. The conservative elites of the Weimar Republic did not believe restraint was wrong. They just believed it was impractical. They faced conditions that felt overwhelming. Militant communists organizing in the streets, paramilitary violence erupting across cities, hyperinflation wiping out savings, and a political culture fractured beyond recognition. Parliamentary coalitions collapsed, public confidence evaporated, the state appeared incapable of enforcing order, much less commanding any respect. Under those circumstances, constitutional restraint began to look like a luxury, something appropriate for stable times, but dangerously naive in a moment of existential threat. So the conservatives made a decision that has been repeated countless times throughout history. They convinced themselves that they could temporarily suspend the limits. Now, they didn't outright reject the Constitution. They told themselves they were preserving it. They didn't deny the importance of legality. They claimed extraordinary measures were necessary this time to save the order itself. Emergency powers were framed as defensive tools, not permanent transformations. They believed they could use power to restore order and then put power back on the shelf. And that belief was fatal because power does not return itself. Once legitimacy is replaced by dominance, the system has crossed a threshold it cannot uncross. Authority no longer flows from the law, it flows from effectiveness. Obedience no longer rests on consent. It rests on fear, force, and exhaustion. And once that shift occurs, the entire political environment changes. You can never stop ruling by fear. In Weimar Germany, constitutional norms did not disappear overnight. They eroded incrementally. Emergency decrees became common. Parliamentary procedures were bypassed. Executive authority expanded under the logic of necessity. Each step was presented as a response to a crisis. Each was explained as unavoidable. And each one weakened the very idea that law governed politics at all. The conservative elites believed they could manage this process, that they could wield extraordinary power responsibly while containing more radical forces within. They assumed they could set the boundaries, define the limits, and decide when normal rules would resume. And they were fucking wrong. Because once legitimacy is replaced by dominance, power begins to reward a very specific type of actor. Not the most prudent or the most principled or the most cautious, but the most ruthless. In a power-centered system, restraint becomes a disadvantage. Moral hesitation becomes weakness. The political environment selects for those willing to go further, faster, and with fewer scruples. It's not a moral judgment. It is a structural reality. The Weimar conservatives discovered too late that by banning constitutional restraint, they had created a system in which they themselves couldn't survive. They had normalized emergency authority. They had delegitimized parliamentary rule. They had taught the public that legality was conditional and that force was sometimes necessary. When a more radical faction arrived, the brown shirts and Hitler, when willing to use power without hesitation, the conservatives had no principled ground left on which to stand. They had already accepted the logic of his argument. They could not suddenly argue for restraint after proving it was optional. They could not appeal to legitimacy after treating it as expendable. They could not defend constitutionalism after suspending it whenever they fucking felt like it. They had disarmed themselves intellectually and institutionally and ethically. The tragedy of Weimar is often mischaracterized as a failure of conservatism itself. In reality, the failure was to remain conservative in the fucking first place. The conservatives did not lose because they valued limits too highly. They lost because they abandoned them. They didn't lose because they respected law too much. They lost because they taught everyone, including their enemies, that the law could be set aside. And once that lesson was learned, the outcome was no longer in doubt. A political order grounded in emergency powers cannot survive the arrival of a faction that treats emergencies as permanent. I'm going to say that again. A political order grounded in emergency powers cannot survive the arrival of a faction that treats emergencies as permanent. You know, like the Patriot Act, for example. A system that defines authority by necessity cannot resist those who manufacture necessity. You set the rules and people take advantage of it. A regime that replaces legitimacy with dominance inevitably elevates the most dominant actors, and the most dominant are usually the craziest. This is the core lesson that Weimar offers. Constitutional restraint is not a luxury reserved for stable times. It is precisely in those times where shit is all fucked up that you need that stability and a group of people who will preserve it, conserve it maybe. The conservative elites believed they were being pragmatic, but they believed they were adapting to reality, to the modern times. They believed they could outmaneuver the radicals within their own party by borrowing their tools without adopting their worldview. But tools shape outcomes. Methods carry logic. And once you adopt a method that treats law as optional, you cannot control who uses it next. Weimar did not collapse because conservatives were too principled. It collapsed because they stopped being principled at all, in the moment when it mattered most. They believed power could be borrowed and returned, and it can't. They believed dominance could be temporary. It isn't. They believe restraint could wait. It never can. What you do now is what matters. And by the time they understood their mistake, the system no longer belonged to them. The rules they had weakened could not protect them. The legitimacy they had traded away could not be reclaimed. And that's the enduring lesson from Weimar. The warning it offers to every society tempted to treat limits as expendable in the face of fear. Once restraint is abandoned, power does not flow back to the cautious. It flows to the ruthless, always. And any movement that forgets this risks repeating it, no matter how noble the intentions or how dire the consequences. Now, once again, the founders were not naive about power. In fact, they were preoccupied by it. They warned about it constantly, not because they distrusted government in the abstract, but because they understood human nature too well to trust authority without restraint. James Madison's insight was not that ambition was rare, it was that ambition was inevitable. His solution was not to suppress it, nor to pretend it could be purified, but to contain it structurally. Ambition, he argued, must be made to counteract ambition, not unleashed in the hope that the right people would wield it responsibly. Hope is not a game plan, folks. That sentence alone demolishes much of modern political thinking. Madison did not believe the danger lay primarily with bad intentions. He believed the danger lay with unchecked power itself. Even well-intentioned actors, once unrestrained, would rationalize excess. Even virtuous leaders, once insulated from limits, would drift toward abuse. The problem was not simply corruption, it was concentration. George Washington understood a related danger, factions. He warned that when political identity hardens into loyalty to groups rather than shared principles, legitimacy begins to erode. Faction does not merely divide a society, it teaches citizens to view one another as enemies rather than just rivals within a common civic framework. Once that happened, restraint no longer feels virtuous, it feels foolish. Compromise feels like betrayal, political defeat. Every single one begins to feel existential. Washington feared this outcome not because disagreement was dangerous, but because unchecked factions turned disagreement into warfare. When loyalty shifts from constitutional order to partisan identity, the system loses its authority to mediate conflict. Power rushes in to fill the void. John Adams warned of a deeper, more uncomfortable truth. Constitutional government requires a moral people, not a perfect people, not saintly, but people who accept limits on themselves as well as on others. No written constitution, no matter how carefully designed, can restrain a population that has decided restraint is obsolete. So I'm just sick of hearing people blame the Constitution. It's not working. No, you're not working, asshole. Adams understood that liberty is not self-sustaining. It depends on the habits of character, respect for law, patience with process, and a willingness to lose without seeking revenge for your loss. When those habits decay, constitutions do not fail dramatically, they fail quietly, as their safeguards are treated as inconveniences rather than necessities. What unites these warnings is a shared rejection of a dangerous illusion that power can justify itself. None of the founders believed authority was legitimate simply because it was effective. None believed victory alone conferred moral right. None believed emergency suspended the need for principle. They understood that crises tempt societies to abandon restraint, and that this temptation has destroyed more republics than external enemies ever have or ever will. They also understood something modern movements refuse to accept. Emergencies are rarely temporary. Once a society permits extraordinary measures in the name of necessity, those measures develop constituencies of their own. Entire movements, entire businesses stand up around these ideas. What begins as an exception becomes precedent. What is justified once becomes justifiable again, and eventually restraint itself becomes the real threat. This is why the founders placed legitimacy above victory. They knew that a republic could survive lost elections and unpopular decisions and even shit leaders. What it could not survive was the belief that rules only applied when convenient. And once that belief takes hold, law becomes a suggestion, process becomes theater, power becomes the only language that matters, which is why people are talking about it right now on the right. And once a society abandons principle, it can't get it back through force. It gets something else instead. History is pretty consistent on this point. When legitimacy collapses, people do not demand more debate. They demand order, and they accept authoritarianism every single time. When institutions lose authority, individuals look for strong figures who promise stability without restraint, which is how you get a communist elected in New York City. When process fails, power fills the vacuum. This is how republics end, not with chaos, but with consolidation. You get Caesar, you get Napoleon, or you get fucking Hitler. Not because people suddenly desire tyranny, but because they have been taught slowly, rationally, and often with good intentions that principle is a luxury they can no longer afford. This time it's different. But it isn't. The founders warned against this outcome relentlessly. They built a system designed to resist it. They understood that the moment a society decides power matters more than legitimacy, the outcome is no longer in doubt. The names may change, the circumstances may differ, but the result is always the same. And here's the hard truth modern conservatives must finally confront. You cannot save civilization by becoming what threatens it. You cannot defeat postmodern politics by adopting postmodern logic and strategies. You cannot defend liberty by discarding the very principles that gave liberty meaning in the first place. This is a fatal confusion of the age. The belief that power can be used without being transformed by it. That the tools of domination can be borrowed temporarily, and that restraint can be restored after victory is secured. History offers no evidence for this belief. It offers overwhelming evidence against it. Power is not a conservative argument. It is the argument made after conservatism has already failed, after limits have been dismissed as naive, after process has been labeled weakness, after legitimacy has been treated as expendable. By the time a movement speaks only in the language of dominance, it has already abandoned the intellectual ground that made it distinct. The temptation to do so is understandable. Modern politics is exhausting. It feels asymmetrical. Rules appear to be enforced selectively. Institutions feel captured. Good faith feels unrewarded. In that environment, rage feels honest, and shortcuts feel practical. Domination feels necessary, existential. But necessity is the oldest excuse for tyranny. It's not unique today. The way forward is not rage. Rage narrows vision and accelerates escalation. It transforms disagreement into existential threat and replaces judgment with impulse, emotional thinking. A movement animated by rage may feel powerful, but it quickly becomes brittle, incapable of restraint, allergic to legitimacy, and unable to govern without coercion. How many revolutions have led to a successful government after? Very few in human history. And only the ones that were governed by principle. The way forward is not shortcuts. Shortcuts bypass the very safeguards that make self-government possible. They may deliver temporary advantage, but they hollow out institutions and normalize exceptions that cannot be reversed. Every shortcut teaches the next generation that rules are optional and power is the only real currency. The way forward is not domination. Domination does not conserve anything. It consumes. A politics that seeks to crush rather than persuade eventually destroys the conditions that make persuasion meaningful at all. When politics becomes war by other means, law becomes weapon and liberty becomes collateral damage, then what is the point? The way forward's harder, it's slower, and that is precisely why it works. It requires, first, a return to principles, not slogans, but as governing commitments. No platitudes. You have to actually believe it. Natural rights, not shifting outcomes, are the foundation of justice. Individual responsibility and not collective guilt are the basis of moral judgment. Equal law, not factional advantage, are the conditions of legitimacy. Legitimacy before victory, not victory at any cost. Restraint before power, not power justified by intention. This path is unsatisfying to impatient people because it offers no guarantees. It demands discipline into perpetuity without immediate reward. It requires losing battles sometimes without abandoning the war for legitimacy. It insists that some methods remain forbidden even if they're effective. A conservative, when they see a weapon in government, don't seize it for themselves to use. They fucking destroy the weapon. End of fucking story. And this is the only path that preserves a republic worth saving. A free society does not survive because it always wins. It survives because it refuses to become what it fears. It survives because it treats limits not as weakness, but as achievements, hard won and easily lost. It survives because it understands that power without principle is not strength. It is decay and its moral weakness. The choice before us is not abstract. It's not left versus right. It's not victory versus defeat. It's principle versus power. And that choice, despite everything, still belongs to us. This has been Citizen.